Well, here I'm at the edge of the YVC campus on an early November day, and sunflowers are just hanging on. I mean, aren't they beautiful? Don't they just brighten your day? This looks like a great day to help erase all memory of summer. We're really starting into winter right now, but sunflowers are just so bright and cheerful. There's a lot of members of the sunflower family. It's a huge family. Daisies, sagebrush, and lots of other plants that you probably have around your yard and you see all the time. Some you wouldn't think are related to this, like the sagebrush that covers the hills around most of eastern Washington. So let's take a look at this huge and very important family, the sunflower family. Older names for this family is Compositae, and if you see some old literature, you'll probably see that name referenced as well, instead of Asteraceae, but we'll just call it the sunflower family. There are a lot of examples in Washington state, and plenty of them look like this fleabane or yarrow or the goldfields, really properly daisy-like, but others, like the big sagebrush that's so common, really kind of hide. You wouldn't really guess that these are in the sunflower family. They don't look like sunflowers. So where does this whole thing fit? Well, they're right here. They're a member of the eudicots, or just dicots, and with 30,000 species, they make up a full 10% of this group of angiosperms, or flowering plants. That's pretty impressive. So there's a lot of these guys. We'll just barely scratch the surface. How would you even know you had a plant in the sunflower family? Well, these vegetative characteristics don't really help. It's the flowers, and specifically those flowers arrangements in heads, usually with a bunch of these bracts underneath, kind of these leafy parts that you can see right here on this balsamroot. So a bunch of little leaves underneath, or bracts. Now, the flowers arranged in heads, there are two types. Here we can see on this Arnica up here, there are disc flowers in the middle, and then all these ray flowers radiating like little rays of sunshine all throughout. So those are the two types. Each of those flowers then, disc or ray, have 5 little petals. So the disc flowers in particular have little petals, and then usually a little hole down here that leads to the ovary down below, which develops into what we call an achene, this type of fruit, which is basically a little sunflower seed, but usually much, much smaller. And when they mature, you can see right in the middle here all these little achenes, just these single seeds with a hole around them, and then they have this pappus or plume attached to them that carries them off on the wind, just like the dandelion you're so familiar with already. So that tells us it is in the sunflower family. Now, if you want to go from there, you got a lot of work to do because there's a lot of these guys. So what would we use to help us tell the difference? Leaves and other growth forms, they're important to note, but really it's the flower details that are going to help get you there. So you need to know, do they have disc flowers or ray flowers or both? A lot of them, like this Silvercrown over here, have only disc flowers. Many of them, like daisies and others, have both of them, and some have only ray flowers, like dandelions and others in that group. Chicory would be another example. Obviously, the flower color is important to note. That's going to help you out. And then the details, and you need a good magnifying glass for this, is the details of the pappus. Those little bristles on top of the achene, like this thing here on the dandelion, that's some of the key features. So these are not things that you just kind of glance at and then open up a book and you get right to it. It'll take some work, but with practice, I think you can get to know quite a few of them. Well, let's start with something familiar like the sunflower itself. So sunflowers are Helianthus annuus. Even the cultivated ones are just varieties of this. It's a native to North America, even Washington state. Some of the terminology, what we think of as this, the flower, is really an inflorescence. It's a collection of flowers. So each of these little guys in here, in the disc, those are lots and lots of flowers. Even each of these big petals that stick out looks like a single petal, but really that's all 5 petals. At the end, you'd see 5 little teeth. So that is one ray flower. And here, this one is pretty far along. You can see these are starting to get ready to fall off, and those are where the sunflower seeds are. But those seeds aren't really just seeds. There's a seed in the middle, and we know that there's a shell around that, and that is the fruit. It's called an achene. And all members of the sunflower family have these dry little fruits that are simple, just like that. So there is Helianthus annuus, is an annual plant. There's another perennial one that you'll find on the dry hills around Yakima called Cusick's sunflower, Helianthus cusickii. Rarely gets over knee high. It dies back in the winter to a perennial rootstock. You can see the resemblance clearly. Has disc flowers and ray flowers, produces tiny little sunflower seeds themselves. But a small plant with kind of the same sort of raspy foliage that likes to grab onto your clothing. So a couple of sunflowers for you to start off our journey. Another close relative of the sunflower is the balsamroot. So balsam roots there are quite a few species around the hillsides of Yakima, growing up even into the forest. And you'll note that they look really quite a bit like the sunflower itself, but they're a different genus. They are pretty similar in their appearance. Even if you turn over the seed heads in the summer, as they start drying out, you'll get a handful of what look a whole lot like tiny little sunflower seeds. And these have a perennial rootstock down here at the ground. We can see some of the last year's leaf stalks still left behind and the new ones coming up through it. These bloom in the spring and peaking around April in the hills around Yakima, a little bit later up in the mountains. The rootstock itself is very thick, given its name to a large extent, balsam root, emphasis on the root part. And this was a staple root crop of the indigenous people here for thousands of years. And even the leaves are edible. So variety of balsam roots around here. Carey's balsam root is a pretty recognizable one, at least in the Yakima area. Really big leaves, big flowers, hard to miss. Really beautifies the landscape considerably. Another sunflower lookalike is Arnica, and this one more commonly lives in the forest, but really only the flowers themselves or the inflorescence remind me of a sunflower. The leaves somewhat, but these leaves are always distinctly opposite on the stem. Sometimes, but not always, kind of heart-shaped in their leaf shape. They do really well after disturbance. Here we see some growing on the forest floor after a fire, and these seed heads that remind me a lot of dandelions. So these should be familiar in many ways. You probably see this along the trail quite a bit if you hike out in the mountains. Another common forest dweller is the silvercrown, and you can see why it gets its name. Again, kind of dandelion-looking seed heads, but doesn't look much like a dandelion or a sunflower in terms of its inflorescence, just disc flowers on this one. These tend to grow in somewhat shaded locations in the forest, but unlike most plants that grow really low, you can see these stout plants all over the place. And when they send up their flowering stalks, they'll get well above waist high, so they're pretty large plants. And even their leaves are really big. They're dissected into these smaller leaflets, but they're larger than your hand. So these are really good-sized plants with large leaves and tall flowering stalks. Goldenrods are lovely. They grow along streams, a lot of disturbed areas. You'll run into them quite often. A lot of people have them growing in their yards. Here's some growing right beside my driveway. I really enjoy them. They're beautiful plants. They grow nice and tall on these tall, straight stems with these long lance-shaped leaves growing alternately on the stem. And then their flowers, each of them individually is not much to look at. Even these flower heads packs about a dozen little flowers into this head, and then hundreds of heads onto the entire inflorescence at the end of the branches, which you can imagine how many seeds they produce. Pretty successful when all these blow off on the wind. Not all of them make it, but there's so many, they're going to land somewhere and grow into these beautiful plants.
Let's branch out from yellow into white. There are plenty of white flowered uh, plants in this family, and so Yarrow was one of those that you're likely to find just about anywhere you head out when you go outdoors. Pretty easy to recognize. It has these flat topped inflorescences that have all these branches that result in just a big cluster of white flowers, the big landing pad for all kinds of pollinators. And each of these has disc and ray flowers on it. These sit on the top of a fairly tall, usually not much taller than knee high, flowering stalk, which sits over a bunch of basal leaves. And these leaves are highly dissected. They look like little feathers. And there's lots and lots and lots of little segments. In fact, the species name millifolium means milli 1,000 leaves. They have a really pleasant aroma to them as well. Smell very herbal, but just in a unique way. Makes a calming tea that a lot of people use medicinally. And you'll find this anywhere from the scorching rocky slopes of the shrub steppe all the way up into the snowy alpine environments. So just about anywhere you go, you'll probably see this nearby. Finish out our color palette with purple, another common color in the color palette of the sunflower family. Thistles are probably just a practical one, no, because you want to avoid them. They are just sharp everywhere. They have sharp little points at the end of their leaves, all along their stem, up here below the flower, just everywhere you look, there are spines, and you'd like to avoid them. These plants really like disturbed areas, so along roadsides, trails, burned areas, yards, you name it, they're probably there. There are quite a few different types, and I won't attempt to describe all those to you. We got the Canada thistle over here, smaller flower heads and finer foliage than the bull thistle over here. Aptly named, it does look like it's just charging at you with these big old round spherical, looks like puffer fish with lots of spikes coming out, and those are the bracts underneath the flower heads. So thistles are a good one to know so that you can steer clear of them. Everything we've talked about so far has been herbaceous, and now we move into a few of the shrubs. These are important because they're there all year round, so they can make important shelter for a lot of animals that can live underneath them. Although not many animals eat it, some rabbits and deer will browse on these leaves occasionally, but they don't taste particularly nice. It's not a huge shrub. It'll get up about chest high. It's fairly delicate looking. It has these grayish green leaves that are linear. Really common to see that sort of thing in hot, dry environments. Grayish leaves to help reflect that extra sunlight, and small and thin because you don't need a huge surface. You're going to overheat and lose too much water. So both those are pretty big advantages when it comes to these hot, dry environments. They do have yellow flowers, just about 5 little flowers in each of those heads, usually perched at the top of the plant. And you'll find this pretty commonly all through the shrub steppe, especially in lower elevations around the area. When lots and lots of them bloom, they can become almost overwhelmingly sweet smelling in the air, giving kind of an interesting species name, nauseosa. We'll close with a group of plants in the genus Artemisia, starting with big sagebrush, which is kind of the plant of the American West. I mean, look at this scene over here at the top right. Pretty iconic. I mean, that just screams the American West. You find this plant all through the Great Basin Desert. Most of eastern Washington is covered with this, whether the lowlands or the foothills. So big sagebrush, really important plant in this area. Good sized shrub. A lot of times it's just about waist high, but it can get over head high in some situations. The sage smell of this has a lot of overlap in terms of like its aroma profile with culinary sage, but don't mistake it for the same thing. You can tell when somebody's been wandering around in the sagebrush. They come back and smell like sage, but this is not pleasant tasting stuff. Very bitter. It'll make you sweat. Has been used by some people as medicine, but not one that most species want to eat. Pronghorn antelope and sagebrush vole may be an exception, 2 species that like to eat this plant, but not many others. In fact, one reason the American West may look a bit like this is because of cattle grazing. The cattle didn't like sagebrush. They ate the grass. The sagebrush survived, spread, and there you go. It's kind of the landscape we have today. You wouldn't necessarily think this be in the sunflower family, but here's its little flower buds. They come out in the late summer. Just three little yellow, or 3 to 5 little yellow disc flowers that come out of that. And so they are sunflowers, even though you wouldn't really peg them for it. You can recognize this plant because it has these long wedge-shaped leaves that reach up into the air with their 3 little teeth at the tip. In fact, its name means 3 teeth when you kind of dissect that one. They're gray to reflect all that extra sunlight, and they point upward so that in the heat of the day, they're not fully exposed to the sunlight. A couple of great adaptations to this tough environment that they live in. So another member of the Artemisia group is the rigid sagebrush. And we actually have 5 species of shrubby sagebrush within Washington state. So this is a close relative of the big sagebrush. But this one grows quite a bit lower to the ground, rarely over knee-high, very compact shrub. Its leaves, which you can kind of make out over here, have 3 tips to them, but they're all long and linear, so they kind of look like this. Similar smell and everything to the sagebrush. Each has their own, of these shrubby species, each has their own habitat preferences that are kind of specific. This one likes the rocky soils, the lithosols, and you'll see these kind of abrupt transitions from big sagebrush to this one. This one has finer leaves, like I said, a different aroma, and kind of an unusual little cluster of flowers that have fallen off at this point up at the top. Another odd one with this is a deciduous member of the sagebrush group. And then lastly, we have the other Artemisia. There are quite a few species that I won't try to go over, but these are actually perennial herbs. They're in the same genus, Artemisia, but usually go by different names like wormwood or ragweed. If you have bad allergies to these are not welcome sights to you. They have these clusters of flowers at the top that put out lots of pollen when they bloom. And they have a similar aroma. They have these usually dissected leaves, although not in all species. This one over here has just these broader leaves, but still kind of that grayish appearance. And so that's the last of our groups in the sunflower family, going from the really bright and showy sunflower down to these not so showy, not obviously sunflower-like plants like the wormwood. Well, that does it for the sunflower family. I hope that helps you feel just a little more familiar with the great diversity of plants that we have here in Washington state. Until next time, happy botanizing.